Well, good afternoon, and again, thank you for attending on the second day. We've had a really great time so far, I believe. So I'm very appreciative of you guys coming and being a part of what we're doing here. So this is our second last plenary session, and we have on this one Dr. Rowe giving us a talk on energy enchantments and energy imaginaries. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Greg. All right, hi again, everybody. So last night we talked about enchantments, disenchantment, and extraction, extractivisms, things like that. I'd like to shift gears a little bit and focus more particularly on energy and energy imaginaries, energy enchantments, and less today on kind of extraction and extractive zones. All right. So energy has long held a key place in the hopes and anxieties of modern imaginaries. Energy policy, the possibility of energy transition, whether we are in energy transition, whether it is necessary, and what we should transition to, are all questions at the forefront of policy debates, political confrontations, and international congresses. Whether in the context of debates about peak oil, concerns about climate change, or talk of an impending energy transition, energy has been something that everyday people, not just policymakers and experts, imagine with, worry about, and think about. But serious thought about energy has more often than not been seen as the exclusive domain of science and engineering. I'd like to suggest today that sense energy has long been something that we have hoped with, dreamed of, something that has sparked our anxieties and imaginaries, something that has been fodder for both philosophical and theological reflection, that energy should not be seen as the exclusive domain of science and engineering, but also a key feature of philosophical and theological reflection. So I am not a scientist, an engineer, a statistician, or an economist. I'm an environmental philosopher and scholar of religion. And in the book that I published recently of Modern Extraction, I examined the philosophical and theological reasons for questioning common assumptions about energy by analyzing the values, concepts, and theologies that have shaped our current understanding of what energy does, what it's for, and how this relates to questions of what it means to be human. In analyzing energy cultures, I've asked questions like, what are the cultural values, assumptions, or meanings fueling current energy practices and policies and systems? What are the cultural values or assumptions produced with and through our energy practices and systems? My approach to energy cultures is broadly informed by the environmental humanities. Predominant approaches to climate change have been through the UN's International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Scientists there gather data, synthesize their studies into reports, and then communicate those reports to policymakers who try to come up with international agreements based on the insights of the sciences. This is crucial work that must be continued. But when it comes to enacting broad level change, it has not hit its mark. Environmental humanities came about as a result of the repeated failures of the IPCC approach to enact the kinds of change it deemed necessary. 20 years into the history of the IPCC and continued failed COP, that's Congress of the Parties, meetings, scholars began asking, why is it that 20 years into this process, the more we know about climate change, the more carbon emissions we produce? Clearly, more and better data does not always lead to system changes, policies change, behavior change, driving climate change. We have assumed in the IPCC approach, we've assumed that there's a direct connection between knowledge and action. But this approach doesn't consider that policies and systems are not driven by data, but by habits, behaviors, desires, cultural narratives, and assumptions. These cultural aspects also need analysis if there is to be real, meaningful change toward a just and sustainable future. Environmental humanities scholars have emphasized that analyzing these cultural influences are precisely what the humanities do best. Humanities disciplines like philosophy, literature, sociology, cultural studies, history, and religion all have well-developed tools, methods, and perspectives to study precisely the kinds of cultural values that have created and continue to sustain societies that proliferate waste, let loose nuclear radiation and chemicals that have never been properly tested, and create the conditions for potentially devastating climate change. Similarly, energy, left to STEM fields alone, leaves unexamined many of the factors that are clearly having wide-reaching impacts on voting patterns, social acceptability of IPCC policy statements, and embrace or reluctance to systemic change. As a particular expression of the environmental humanities, petroculture studies and energy humanities scholars analyze energy cultures. They analyze the values, narratives, histories, psychology, philosophy, and religious logics that have infused past cultures as a way not only to not only understand them, but the current context, and as a key step to start thinking, feeling, and believing differently. So today I'd like to focus on a particularly influential cultural imaginary about energy. One of the most common ways to think about energy closely aligns it with human fulfillment or full development. In the modern context, it's been common to assume a link or causal relationship between energy increase and human development. Take, for example, Lewis Mumford's influential 1934 Technics and Civilization, which described 4 stages in the role of energy and societal development. Societies developed, he argued, according to the amount of energy they are able to activate. Only on the 4th stage, creation, when energy is no longer just sustaining civilization but available in excess, can societies create great works of art, literature, knowledge production, architecture, and meaningful symbols that characterize human fulfillment. Only at the point when, quote, the human animal is supplied with more energy than it needs to maximize its physical existence, can a society help actualize human potential. So that's Lewis Mumford. There we go. Similarly, anthropologist Leslie White stated in his 1943 essay, Energy and the Evolution of Culture, his law of cultural evolution. Quote, culture develops when the amount of energy harnessed by man per capita per year is increased, or as the efficiency of the technological means of putting this energy to work is increased, or as both factors are simultaneously increased, end quote. Here, energy has a directionality. Its aim is properly actualized when a society can properly harness sufficient energy to help develop culture. Mumford's and White's views anticipate what became identified as the Kardashev scale. Nikolai Kardashev proposed this method of measuring levels of civilization's technological advancement in 1964. This scale defines a civilization according to the capacity it has to access and store energy for consumption from its surrounding environment. Like Mumford and White, it assumes a causative connection between a civilization's level of development based on the amount of energy it has access to. While this scale, the Kardashev scale, has played a key role in sci-fi narratives, it is also something that many scientists take seriously. Carl Sagan, for example, calculated that the Earth had not yet reached even a level 1 on the Kardashev scale, but is at a level 0.7 currently. Physicist Michio Kaku, in response to Sagan's calculations, then remained hopeful about Earth's ability to reach a level of a Type 1 civilization in about 100 to 200 years. But in doing so, he emphasizes, it would require a 3% increase in energy consumption per year for the next 100 or 200 years. Each of these positions assumes not only a correlation, but a causal relationship between increased energy capacity and increased human fulfillment. So for this reason, I identify this as a kind of energy developmentalism. This link between human development and increased energy has long been an assumption in the modern West, but increasingly it's being questioned and challenged by empirical data. Ecological economists like Julia Steinberger have identified a decoupling of energy from GDP over the past 70 years. And similarly, the Boston University's Institute for Global Sustainability Visualizing Energy project has analyzed data on energy use and various markers for human development, like the UN Preferred Human Development Index, the HDI, the more comprehensive social progress index, which is mapped out here on the screen, and other various metrics in life satisfaction. In each case, whether you're looking at HDI or this one, the social progress index, in each case, a similar pattern emerges. At lower energy use levels, small increases in energy can lead to notable improvements. But after reaching 80 to 100 gigajoules per person per year, this relationship starts to fade. So you can see here in this here we see a very close correlation and a very close correlation between an increase of energy and social progress. But after that, after reaching 80 to 100 gigajoules per person, this relationship starts to fade. In fact, as energy scholar Vaclav Smil has demonstrated, after about 200 gigajoules per year per capita, the relationship can even be counterproductive. So to put these numbers in perspective, Smil notes that US residents have far surpassed both markers, with energy consumption at 360 gigajoules per year per capita in 2017. This image from the BU Visualizing Energy project demonstrates this phenomena. We can clearly see increases in the social progress index are tightly correlated with increases of energy in the 0 to 100 range, but then after 100, there's increasing variability and distribution in markers for social progress. And after 200 mark, after the 200 mark, the correlation becomes even more diffuse. Especially noteworthy is countries like South Korea, which I've identified some of them up there. South Korea, Belgium, Australia, Sweden, Finland, Germany, Japan, Denmark, Ireland, and the UK, all of which exceed the US in social progress index, but with lower levels of energy use per capita in 2021. Though this connection between energy and human fulfillment without limit is a prevalent assumption in modern contexts, what I found in the course of my research is that an assumed connection between energy and human development is not new, but actually based on ancient approaches to energy's precursor, energeia. Aristotle came up with the term energeia, building from a distinction that Plato had made between the mere possession of a thing and the use of a thing. Aristotle identified the use of a thing, or as David Bradshaw translates, the exercise of a capacity, as energeia. A capacity possessed, by contrast, so that it could be used but wasn't currently being exercised or currently being used, was dunamis, or in Latin potentia. Aristotle further specifies that energeia is the exercise of a capacity that is complete in its act. It doesn't just describe an ongoing process or something that will one day be completed, but energeia is something that is fulfilled as it is enacted. Aristotle differentiates energeia from other terms using the metaphor of building a house. Building a house requires, he says, dunamis, kinesis, which is what we would usually translate as motion, metabole, what we usually translate as change, but for Aristotle, not energeia, because it is not an activity that is complete in its enactment. When one, he says, you should use the tense test. When one is building a house, it is not at the same time built, right? So this example that Aristotle gives by contrast for energeia is sight. When one sees, one at the same time has seen. So that's an activity that is complete in its action, right? As opposed to building a house, which only happens over time and over an extended process. Unlike building a house, seeing is complete in its activity. Other examples Aristotle gives of actions that are complete in their activity are thinking, understanding, living well, and flourishing. Fulfillment or completion is such a key part of this term. Fulfillment or completion is such a key part of what this term signifies for Aristotle that at times he, and especially later interpreters, uses it interchangeably with entelechy. Ancient thinkers readily took up Aristotle's term. Early Christians were no exception. Starting with St. Paul and his letters to early Christian communities written between 50 and 60 of the Common Era that became part of the Christian New Testament, Paul relies on Aristotle's term, energeia. But he applies it in a way that philosopher David Bradshaw has called unprecedented among ancient thinkers. While Aristotle and followers use the term broadly to describe a complete exercise of a capacity, Paul uses the term solely in reference to spiritual agents or supernatural action. Here, energeia is brought into the exclusive purview of an agent. It becomes an instrument or a tool for Paul exclusively of spiritual agents. Paul also links the term to salvation theology, applying the language of energeia to express a sense of human fulfillment through the embrace of the divine. Paul's restriction and unique usage of the term became influential, and early Christian thinkers followed in his wake. After Paul, for early Christians, energy was not just the activity of an exercise or capacity, but a capacity associated with the presence of the divine and associated with salvation as human fulfillment. But how does this impact modern energy? In calling for and initiating the new science of power and action, or dynamics, 18th century philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz expressly drew on the distinction that Aristotle had made between energeia and dunamis to differentiate between what Leibniz called vis viva and vis mortua, which roughly corresponds to what became potential and kinetic energy. In the 19th century, the science of dynamics became thermodynamics as scientists and engineers tried to make sense of and make more efficient modern machines and early engines. In the modern sense, energy came to be most commonly defined as the ability to do work. Contrary to most conflict narratives of religion and science, historians and energy humanities scholars like Terra have persuasively demonstrated that for premier Scottish energy scientists like Lord Kelvin, Peter Guthrie Tait, James Clerk Maxwell, their energy science was not articulated in opposition to their evangelical Protestant faith, but was seen as something that confirmed it. In the process, their views of energy were infused with beliefs about divine power. Most significantly for Terra, their energy science became infused with a Protestant work ethic, notably the value of work as a way of fighting against waste, destruction, decay, and a loss of order. So I'm broadly in agreement with Daggett's assessment of modern energy being primarily associated with work and the demonization of waste. However, I think that this modern emphasis on work was not a departure, as Daggett suggests, but a continuation of ancient patterns of associating energeia with actualization, since work itself serves the purpose of always aiming toward completion and fulfillment. Where ancient energeia signified completion or fulfillment itself, modern energy builds from a Pauline slide to focus on an agent's use of energy as a tool that aids or leads to human fulfillment. In modernity, energy is no longer fulfillment itself, but something that could be put to work to aid human completion. Philosopher Michael Marder offers another intriguing analysis of the influence of ancient energeia on modern energy. Rather than continuity between energeia and modern energy, Marder argues that modern energy has in fact reversed ancient energeia. Where energeia signified for Aristotle fulfillment and completion, modern energy has left that behind to pursue dunamis or potentia without end. So Marder makes an intriguing case. As I have shown, Aristotle explicitly differentiated energeia from terms like kinesis, movement, or metabole, like change. And modern energy, starting with Leibniz's science of dynamics, welds together movement, by contrast, modern energy, starting with Leibniz's science, welds together movement, change, and energy. Indeed, precisely the activities required to build a house which Aristotle excluded from energeia would now be associated with energy. For Marder, moderns are not energeia occupied, but potentia obsessed. So consequently for Marder, there's something of Aristotle's energeia that needs to be reclaimed as we dream of alternative energies. Given Aristotle's associations of energeia with sight, thinking, and the good life, Marder suggests that reclaiming energeia might look more like contemplative practices of mindful meditation or contemplative prayer. There are some profound insights in Marder's work. And I agree that modern energy does emphasize a sense of motion, change, and progress much more than Aristotle would have maintained. Yet, I don't think that moderns have felt that they need to choose. I think that fossil fuel capitalism has produced consumers who are brilliantly innovative of having our cake and eating it too. My sense is that for moderns, we desire the dunamis of progress only because it promises to someday actualize in something that we would consider the good life. Moderns have been able to retain a commitment to energeia's promise of fulfillment in pursuit of dunamis. If modern energy had truly left behind associations with completeness, wholeness, consummation, and fulfillment, as Marder suggests, We would not see these consistent energy narratives articulated by Mumford, White, and Kardashev claiming such clear causal connections between energy and human fulfillment. We also wouldn't see such clearly retained links between energy concepts, divine action, and human fulfillment that have emerged in the form of electrical and petrotheologies. Electricity and magnetism were articulated in the 17th and 19th century, again, contrary to common conflict narratives of religion and science as profoundly enchanted. Historians of the time period emphasized that it was common in the 18th and 19th century to attribute godlike powers to electricity as a source of all animation in life. And Alessandro Volta, for example, was convinced he had discovered a life-giving fluid which, with some subtle conditioning, could resurrect the dead. By the 18th and 19th century US, a fully developed electrical theology had developed. Historian Carolyn Marvin asserts that for many, quote, electrical science was treated as an extension of religious revelation. A conclusion upheld by the belief that, quote, electricity contained the divine power to bestow life. Furthermore, Furthermore, religion historian Brett Malcolm Granger emphasizes that, quote, it was common for writers in the 18th and early 19th centuries to ascribe nearly godlike powers to electricity, giving credence and religious weight to electric cures and reinforcing a sense that electricity had acted as an important medium for divine aims for human fulfillment. Granger has recently argued that electrical theologies infused and profoundly influenced the beginnings of US evangelicalism in the First and Second Great Awakenings. It was not uncommon, he points out, for early evangelicals to explicitly describe their conversion experiences in terms of electrified affect, suggesting that these new technologies and sciences were not banishing religiosity as is commonly held by theories of secularism and modern disenchantment, but creating new forms of it. Just as expressions of energy science, electricity and magnetism were not squelching but extending the bounds of religion, so too petroleum created new forms of religion. Oil, first extracted at a commercial scale in the mid-19th century, was used early on primarily as a lubricant and an illuminant. But it was soon employed as a fuel, and so its reception was informed by these previous alignments between forms of energy and religious ideas about human fulfillment. To analyze the enduring enchantments of energy concepts and materialities, I've been employing the term petrotheology. This is a term first introduced by Margaret Atwood in her novel, The Year of the Flood, to talk about the kinds of logics employed by a group in her novel that she calls the Petrobaptists. Religion scholar Marian Grau has started employing this term as well in 21. I'm using it to signal the way that petroleum has been communicated, explained, and historicized in theological terms. In the mid to late 19th century, several histories of petroleum industry tell the story of petroleum in the scope of salvation history, with moments of creation, fall, redemption, and evangelism. So I use the term to refer to logics of petroleum that take on characteristics or function as theologies. I also use the term to signal the ways that petro and energy technosciences have not functioned as a replacement for religion, but have been employed as a means to extend the boundaries of what counts as religion. Consistently, these petrotheologies tell the story of oil within the scope of creation and redemption of the world. Here, fulfillment narratives of energeia and salvation histories of Christianity find mutual resonance in oil. Many of these petrotheologies were articulated to be recognized within an orthodox view of Christianity. Reverend S.J. Eaton's text, Petroleum, is one example. Eaton's book, published just 7 years after petroleum had first been discovered in his home region of Titusville, Pennsylvania. His book tells the story of oil as a fulfillment narrative in the scope of salvation history, complete with moments of creation, fall, and redemption in present oil booms. Such overlapping narratives also allow for a slide between divine power and the power of oil. In the last chapter, Peter addresses a remarkable question. Already 7 years in, people were asking, are we doing this too much, too fast? Will there be a limit to oil? Eaton's response is a resounding no. There will be no limit, no end to oil. But his reasoning is even more interesting. In addressing the limits of oil, he references the limits of divine omnipotence. There is no limit, surely, to omnipotence. A new lesson has been taught the world that God's treasures are inexhaustible and that his hand can never be shortened. In short, for Eaton, trust in divine omnipotence means trust in unlimited oil. Conversely, to question the limits of oil is to question the limits of God. Just as Eaton narrates oil within the scope of Christian theology and of creation and redemption, John J. McLaurin's story of oil traces the contours of a Christian theology of creation and redemption, upping the ante to portray oil as an incarnational Christ figure. In the first comprehensive history of religion and oil in the U.S., Anointed with Oil, the subtitle is How Christianity and Crude Made Modern America, historian Darren Dochuk has emphasized how from its earliest discovery in Titusville, oil was consistently hailed as a savior, as agent of God's redeeming action in the world. As the first oil wells aligned with social division leading up to the U.S. Civil War, many expressed hopes at the time that petroleum would prove salvific for the country, providing a way out of or beyond war. For many, quote, petroleum registered as a mystical fount that might ease America out of bloodshed and into a new age of peace and prosperity. Oil was to be a healing balm for the body politic. In this context, oil emerged as a redemptive Christ figure. Such a petro-incarnational lens can be found in John J. McLaurin's sketches Include Oil in 1896. True to form, for a traditional theology of redemption, McLaurin starts with the first moments of creation. Mineralogists, he writes, think petroleum was quietly distilling underneath the ground when the majestic fiat went forth, let there be light. The first, quote, star in the East chapter unfolds as a compilation of ancient Eastern textual citations with special emphasis on what he saw as Hebrew Bible references to oil. In this origin story of petroleum, McLaurin makes clear that wisdom about oil is rooted in the Bible, while more subtly at first encouraging a slippage between the techno-scientific narrative of oil and the redemptive Christ figure. In McLaurin's poetic prose, the sweeping redemptive impact of petroleum began in the East and eventually illuminates the whole world. McLaurin not only weds oil to religious themes, imbuing them with religious meaning, but grants oil redemptive power on a global scale. Just as with the proclamation of the gospel, begun in the East with full intention of global redemption, so too, he writes, with John Wesley, petroleum may exultingly exclaim, the whole earth is my parish. In poetic in poetic prose, a section entitled A Petroleum Ideal serves as climax for McLaurin, bridging his section chapters on the East and chapters on the West, while completing the alignment of Christ with petroleum. And I'll read this section in its entirety, because it's really exemplary. So he writes, a ragged street Arab taken to Sunday school by a kind teacher heard for the first time the story of Christ's boundless love and sufferings. Big tears coursed down his grimy cheeks until he could no longer restrain his feelings. Springing upon his seat, the excited urchin threw up his tattered cap to the ceiling and screamed, "Hurrah for Jesus!" It was an honest, sincere, reverent tribute, which the recording angel must have been delighted to note. In like manner, considering its wondrous past, its glowing presence, and its prospective future, men, women, and children everywhere, while profoundly grateful to the divine benefactor for transcendent gift, may fittingly join in a universal hurrah for petroleum! These are not merely excessive enchantments of earlier modernities. Energy and extraction vitalisms continue to inform current forms of petro-exuberance, and now climate denialism. And PASIC, for example, demonstrates that climate denialism doesn't just take on the production of doubt, as Naomi Oreskes has demonstrated in her important analysis of climate change skepticism in her text, The Merchants of Doubt. In addition to skepticism, climate denialism also relies on the celebration of life, liveliness, and vitality, what PASIC calls carbon vitalism. PASIC doesn't focus on the religious dimensions of these vitalisms, but I have emphasized that they are clearly infused with petro-theological affects and logics. Once again, the role of petroleum as a form of energy that aids human fulfillment easily resonates with the Christian creation and redemption narratives. Take, for example, Calvin E. Weisner, leader of an influential think tank that purports Christian stewardship of creation, but actually promotes climate denialism. In 2013, he wrote an op-ed in Christianity Today, an influential and widely read Christian publication. Weisner was responding to a previous op-ed written by climate scientist and fellow evangelical Katherine Hayhoe, who had written to convince evangelicals, that climate change was an issue of concern for Christians. Weisner, arguing against Hayhoe, in a similar manner to Eaton and McLaurin, ties petro to the central arc of Christian redemption narratives. And I'll read this section of his op-ed extensively. All right, so he writes, how did the fossil fuels get where they are? They're the remains of trillions of dead plants and animals, buried under vast layers of sedimentary rock and transformed by heat and pressure into coal, oil, and natural gas. The fact is that they died and were buried. All but the humans were innocent. They were not sinners. They bore God's judgment on a sin not their own. They died, they were buried, and now they're being lifted out of the ground and transformed from matter into energy, leaving a gas, carbon dioxide, as a byproduct. Stop and think for a moment, Weisner continues. Innocent creatures die, are buried, are brought up out of the ground, and bring life to others. Haven't you heard that story before? Of course you have. It's the basic summary of the gospel. Christ, who knew no sin, but became sin for us, that we might be made in the righteousness of God in him, 2 Corinthians, died for our sins according to the scriptures. He was buried. He rose again from the dead on the third day according to the scriptures. At death, the human body is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. Thus it is written, the first Adam became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. He's quoting 1 Corinthians there. Weisner continues, rather than seeing fossil fuels as permanent carbon sequestration, we see them, when transformed into energy, as both literally life-giving life, long and healthy life to billions of human beings who are not carbon footprints, but the footprints of carbon on the one hand, and on the other hand, beautifully picturing the death, burial, and resurrection of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Here Weisner relies on and even intensifies several petrotheological strategies we've seen. With Eaton and McLaurin, Weisner places oil within the scope of redemption history, starting with the first moments of creation through the fall to human fulfillment in redemption. An explicit reference to Paul's theory of resurrection, the death of the seed given rebirth in the form of a plant, was not an anomaly as applied to geological formation. I referenced this some last night, right? As I explained yesterday, in reference to early modern mining theories in Saxony and colonial South America, a theory of mineral growth informed by the organic metaphor of the seed, as well as theories of salvation, full salvation, where full development meant the ripening of a geological form when it was most useful to humanity, has consistently influenced theories of mineral growth from ancient times. Finally, as with Eaton's association of divine omnipotence with oil, so here Weisner also closely aligns oil and redemption, that he can conclude that carbon sequestration is not just uneconomical, not just illogical, but a denial of the resurrection and thus anti-gospel. Too often, tied to ideals of narratives of human fulfillment, energy is not only extracted from the ground, but conceptually extracted from the material conditions that accompany it. In these modern extractive energy, or imaginaries, energy floats free from material relations, transcending relational ties of reciprocity and responsibility to effect a nebulous and excessive vision of human fulfillment for a select few at the expense of earth others and human others. There are clearly strong indications that significant shifts are taking place in current energy resources. Incentives to develop green or renewable energy technologies have encouraged the growth of wind, hydropower, solar, and so-called green hydrogen. Still, as we explore alternative energies, renewables, and other energy transitions, there remains a basic need to foster alternative energy imaginaries. Many proposals for renewable energy do not challenge this coupling of energy and human fulfillment, but rely on it and extend it to make the case for their alternative energies. Richard York and Shannon Bell did an analysis of fuel sources over the past 200 years. Contrary to common narratives of energy transitions from one fuel source to another, from lumber to coal to oil, for example, York and Bell's study demonstrates that we have never really and truly experienced an energy transition. Rather, new energy sources have merely functioned as energy additions, adding to the array of options for fueling an increasingly energy-intensive society. The danger York and Bell demonstrate is that in solely focusing on developing new energy technologies, we are not addressing underlying conditions that would merely add new options to the mix and not lead to a true transition. We need a true transition in energy systems and cultures. And for that to happen, we need more than just sciences and technologies. As studies of ecological economists like Julia Steinberger and the studies of the Boston University Visualizing Energy Project emphasize, there are clearly ways to have meaningful, pleasurable, rich lives at that sweet spot between 100 and 200 gigajoules of energy per person per year. Given the problematic dynamics of disenchantment and the ways it often only produces reactionary re-enchantments, I don't think that a broad brush disenchantment of energy in Christianity would be possible, let alone desirable or effective. But I do think that we can attend with precision to the link between human fulfillment, the ways this slides into theories of salvation, and energy excess. I think the key is a necessary decoupling of energy intensity from views of idealized humanity, completion, or more broadly, visions of the good life. We need philosophical, religious, narrative, and theological endeavors to articulate what energy could mean if it was tied to social, environmental, and economic justice rather than ideals of full development as always requiring an excess. To make that case compelling on a large scale in the US, though, the robust legacy of energy fulfillment needs to be resisted by articulating alternative energy imaginaries, exploring what low carbon pleasure feels like, what kinds of relations shared infrastructure could inspire, and conveying through story, art, theology, and philosophy the kinds of richness that can be enjoyed in less energy intensive practices. Yes, please.
Ray.
Remind me, Brian?
Ray.
Ray. I had the first letter right.
Yeah, you did. At the very beginning of your presentation, you said that we have these facts, evidence is mounting, but it doesn't seem to have led to any change in behavior.
Right.
Right. And you said this is where maybe humanity should come in and help affect behavior change, will be for our good, for the preservation of the planet. So is the role of kind of your work and the humanities more like vision casting, like we need to have this certain vision and we can work towards it? Or would you say, okay, but also here's some real practical steps?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, both and, right? In that those are both the motivation of those practical steps, to do those practical steps, as well as what those practical steps are going to be, are always going to be enticed by narratives, right? They're going to be driven by imaginaries, driven by desires, right? So much of the kind of cultural analysis around energy is looking at both kind of in the past of what are the kinds of desires and drives and narratives that have gotten us where we are today, but then also with a view towards what, if we have a better understanding of what got us here today, then what would need to change for us in the future. So that would mean things like different ways of organizing political power around energy, different ways of organizing economic power around energy, right? And all of those things are accompanied by, narratives and values and desires as well. Is that making sense?
Yeah, so it sounds like, kind of more big picture vision than, or is there any kind of like real practical, to someone who's not an expert in this field like you are, that you'd say, hey Ray, think about it more this way, here's some practical steps kind of a thing?
Right, I think that...
or is that not really your task? You're kind of more on the big picture.
They're certainly not mutually exclusive, right? Like I think that there are some energy humanities scholars who are going to think more kind of broad picture. What are analyzing desires and drives, right? But then what does that mean in terms of practical kind of steps? Maybe others would pick up that task and say, okay, now that we have a better understanding of what a different understanding of energy could look like, then how might that, what would be the implications for our energy infrastructure, right? What are the ways that, do we want to have a national grid? Do we want to have a grid that's just based in Texas? Do we want to have, or do we want to have local grids that allow for more kind of local decision-making and more democratic processes around that? So that would be kind of the step between the desires and drives to more kind of practical steps of infrastructure, of political changes, policy changes, things like that. Does that make sense? Right. Okay. Remind me your name, please.
Yeah, Carl, hi.
Carl, yeah.
Just picking up on Ray's question,
Mhm.
do you think the increased presence of religious delegations at the most recent COP and the planned but unfortunately canceled papal visit, for example, might be a sign that some of these more practical considerations are happening, at least at the level of policy negotiated?
They are, unfortunately, at the last two COPs, this is Congress of the Parties that took place in Scotland, and then the most recent one in help me out. Dubai, yeah, yeah. At both of those, so there are delegations there invited, right? In both of those, the delegations of the petroleum industry outweighed any government, right? Any individual. So yes, there are religious voices there. There are important religious voices, but they are being drowned out, far outweighed. Even countries, even governments are being far outweighed by petroleum delegates at the COP meetings. Yeah, right.
On your graphic you showed of energy usage versus, was it social progress?
Yeah.
I'm just, because it's very fascinating diagram there. How do they I'd be curious how they measured social progress.
Oh yeah, I have that. I wondered if this question might come up. This is their components of social progress. So this would be kind of the HDI is the Human Development Index that the UN usually uses, and so that accounts for things like human health and longevity, things like access to education and things like this. So this is kind of a more expanded version of, or an attempt to be even more holistic than the HDI was. Right, so what this accounts for are opportunity, basic human needs, and foundations of well-being. That includes all things like in opportunity, it's personal rights, personal freedom and choice, inclusiveness, advanced education. So all of those things are taken into account in how they are measuring the social progress index.
So you're saying just like maybe there's current measures of income and happiness levels seem to plateau or trail off as far as increase at a certain level of income. With energy usage, there seems to be this rise and then sort of plateauing at a certain level currently of energy usage. Is that true?
Yeah. So so that's what on several different measures, the HDI and the SPI, in addition to others. Sorry, I'm getting back to it. Oh, here we go. That's what this is showing, is that you see a direct, close correlation between increased energy. So this would be in rural contexts, first opportunity to have electricity, right, or something like that. So kind of that basic level, we do see important correlations between increased length of life, increased health, things like that. But after that, that becomes much more dispersed, and you have countries that are achieving even higher levels of HDI or SPI with lower level of energy use, right? So the assumption of the energy developmentalism is that this is going to just increase exponentially, right? And so we're going to become kind of these superhumans who are like super, super healthy, happy, fully, kind of exponentially, technologically advanced beings as we continue to increase our energy consumption, right? But what we're finding is that that's not the case. That there's this sweet spot between 100 and 200, and that Vaclav Smil, his research corresponds with this, but isn't represented in this. But he emphasizes that even after 200, that's where you can see diminished returns and even an adverse relationship between energy use and human well-being. Does that make any sense?
So this would come into play like policymakers when they were planning that certain population and how much energy this kind of helps set targets for them, I guess.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to emphasize that that energy equity is still an important justice issue, right? And I'm not discounting that that there are some places where increased energy is really crucial, but what oftentimes gets overlooked is that there are places that are living in excess of energy consumption, that even is harming human well-being, and that doesn't get recognized, right? That doesn't get kind of accounted for. Yeah. Yeah.
Dr.
Remind me
Rowe?
of your name.
Keith.
Keith, yeah.
Okay, so this is really interesting. And so a question I have that's very applicable to, I guess, shifting demographics, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the West is currently becoming less Christianized, but it has 2,000 years of this Christian incubation. The global South, the majority world, is having extreme Christian growth, but without that incubation period. So, is there any data on how, like, for instance, in the majority world, are they going to pick up on some of these dunamis energeia themes and all of a sudden start spending energy like crazy? And as the West becomes less Christian, will we stop as much energy usage? You see the question, is there any data on that yet?
No, not that I'm aware of, but I think it's interesting, right? Like, I think that we would want to look at things like, what are the kinds of Christianity that are really flourishing in the global South, and those aren't disconnected from Euro-American context, right? Oftentimes, the versions of Christianity that are flourishing there are because of Euro-American missions there, right? So you're right in that they haven't had that incubation period, but that's not irrelevant either,
They're still
right?
influenced.
They're still getting the theologies that are from that context.
Right.
But that's to say, like, it's also not to say that Christians in the global South are just gonna take that passively, right? Like, they're clearly going to make it their own in a new way and infuse that with their environmental surroundings, their histories, their cultures. And so I think that would be really interesting to see, what kinds of Christianities are emerging or will emerge. And then the next question, which you're asking, I think will be really interesting, is what kinds of energy values that will produce. I don't have any data on that. I can only speculate with you at the moment at that, and I think it's a really interesting question. Yeah. Yeah.
He's got a question.
Yes, please. Your name?
Ryan.
Ryan? Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. So to go back to your energy values, and on that graph, you have America as, we have 316, I think it's gigajoules you said, as energy per capita. I feel like a lot of that energy is focused on our education system, and to forward our social progress in like colleges or schools, how can we take away from that without harming the social progress being made with it?
Yeah, so I don't know off the top of my head how much of that energy would be for education, but I know it's not the majority. I know the majority of it is in manufacturing and in travel, right? So that's kind of the real area to focus on. I mean, people have been educated and educated very well before the last 20 years, right? So we have pedagogical tools, we have pedagogical resources that can work very well without these things in our hands. Many of us in the room maybe think that they might work a little better. But yeah, I mean, I think that it will pose challenges, certainly. But I think that we will not be on unprecedented grounds in trying to decarbonize education. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay.
Okay, so I want to ask a question about the Eaton, S.J. Eaton,
Yeah.
and his, which was really, love that, his work on petroleum was the name of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm understanding his kind of theology correctly, it's, so we're thinking we're connecting our resources and our use of resources to a theological framework. And his is that God is omnipotent, his provisions are bountiful, so praise God for petroleum, right? That kind of idea. So it seems like there's a similar framework, or well, yeah, a similar perspective in that same framework that would suggest that on this side of climate change, the climate change crisis, that we could have from the same camp a theological framework that says God is just and we've screwed up, and now we're suffering God's judgment.
Yeah.
Have you seen any kind of petrotheology in that way that's kind of come out in recent years, or has it just been blind-eyed up to anything like that?
No, I haven't seen, so I love this, and this is precisely the kind of work that I'm arguing needs to happen, right? That's still an enchanted view of petroleum, right? But it's still very much infused with a theology. It's a different kind of petrotheology that I think is really needed to counter the kind of exuberant petrotheology. I have certainly seen it in terms of Christian energy ethics. But part of my work, like a key contribution of my work is saying that outlining the kind of the scope of Christian energy ethics and trying to explain why in the really kind of rich resources of Christian energy ethics, why petroleum is not on the radar, right? It's not there, it's not been addressed, right? And so part of my argument is saying because Christian energy ethics has approached this problem from a disenchantment perspective, right? And they've not been able to account for the ways that Christianity has also infused energy science and petroleum, right? And so we need to get there in order to fully even see what the scope of the problem is.
Do you think part of it is because we've transferred this kind of rich theological perspective into just kind of a metaphor, kind of like the Christianity Today op-ed, right? I mean, it seems like there's a kind of disenchantment of the resources going on there, and we're just going to talk about it in terms of metaphor. So here's something that can really help us think really nicely about our own salvation, what Christ did for us, but it's just carbon that we use for energy, right?
Oh, I guess I was reading Beisner as interpreting, as not disenchanting, but interpreting oil as part of God's redemptive plan.
Yeah,
right?
I don't
As
think.
part of.
Yeah, respectfully, I would say that probably not. It seems like it's more than, now I would need to read the whole article, obviously, so I may completely have this wrong. But it seems, because this is my camp, this is my tribe, you know what I mean? It seems more likely that they would say, this is a really rich and significant metaphor that we can use to help us get to a deeper truth, which is something we can find all around us. But yeah, there's no redemptive plan in the fossil fuels and their being resurrected and all that kind of stuff. It's just a really great illustration.
Okay, yeah, I mean, the way I was reading him is having a sense that these are resources that God has planted from the beginning of creation, and they are there for this precise purpose, and this precise purpose is something that is redemptive. And so I was seeing him as not just saying it was kind of a good metaphor, but as something that was he wouldn't go as far as say Eaton, right? McLaurin, who slid into like a oil as being kind of an incarnational Christ figure.
Right.
That's not what I'm arguing with Beisner.
Okay.
Right? He's not saying that this is a Christ figure, but it is something I think in my reading that he is that is
like a redemption of nature.
it's something that God planted within nature.
All right.
Right? And I think that's the other kind of thing that really messes with a lot of eco-theologies who approach this problem from a disenchantment narrative. They would say that the problem with most evangelical theologies is that it degrades the material world and only values the spiritual, right? It's about plucking souls from the material world. But Beisner, I think, messes with that in a really interesting way, in that he seems to be granting not just instrumental value, but a kind of sacred value to something in the material world.
Very good. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, please. You're Dr. Yoder?
Yeah, Tim.
Sorry, okay, yeah.
On following a little bit what Greg was saying, this oil and the spiritual, or that the oil will never run out or something like that. It's interesting that some of you might have, Wayne Grudem, who's a prominent evangelical theologian, very conservative, wrote a textbook on ethics a few years ago, which I reviewed. And in that book, he's a climate change denier.
Okay.
And he says that oil will never run out. That God will
He
never
says
run
that.
out.
Ooh, I want that book.
Yes. God will never run out.
So that this is the other thing the other kind of analysis that I think really needs to happen. So while we have this narrative, is evidently still being narrated today, this sense that oil is never going to run out. By contrast, the UAE, their founding United Arab Emirates, their founding documents state the value of oil, and they stated they portray oil as a God-given gift. But the fascinating thing is, in the mid-20th century, when the UAE got founded and they were writing these founding documents, by contrast to these folks who were saying there will be no end to oil, the UAE was stating that they anticipated taking all of the oil. They anticipated the end of oil already in their founding documents, suggesting that they didn't share the sense that God was omnipotent to always extend oil, but that they would be taking all of it, right? And that, so that's why we're already seeing in the UAE that they're part of their strategy from the beginning has been to take the oil and then create new kind of economic activity around that, anticipating the end of oil. So, right, that's a different petrotheology, coming from a different religion, but also still having a very strong sense of divine omnipotence. So I think there needs to be some kind of cross-religious analysis on the ways that divinity is kind of informing and infusing understandings of oil and the limits of oil and things like that. Yeah. Would you mind sending me that title?
Yeah.
Okay, that would be awesome. Thanks.
I had a question because it's a little bit of a different direction, and in some ways this maybe is like the big question about all these environmental discussions, environmental ethics, things like that, and that is how how can we get to the point where we're making a change? I'm thinking about, I don't know, this popped in my head yesterday, while we were thinking about this, that, you know, when we think about, to use a completely different question, right? The civil rights changes under Martin Luther King and others, right? We had this stirring figure who kind of helped to affect a whole paradigm shift in terms of thinking about civil rights. And it seems to me that's what we need here. I mean, you said we have all this data, but the more data that we have about it, the worse our CO2 production is. Somehow we need something that is going to change the way that we view the use of our resources and the challenge. I mean, barring some kind of cataclysmic disaster which would force us to change, how can we affect a kind of broad scale, not just change of mind, but change of behavior?
Yeah, I mean, I'm afraid I'm probably not going to have a super satisfied answer to that, because that's my question as well. But I think that is why I think we need to be focusing so much on just like the kinds of things that we are moved by, not just data, not just, I mean, that not to discount that, that's important. Right, but we also need to be attending to the kinds of things that motivate us and move us and give us, if not a sense of hope, a sense of meaning, right? And that something can change and that something can shift. I guess one recent example that comes to mind, Dominic Boyer is an energy humanities scholar at Rice University. He has a great book. It's one of those University of Minnesota kind of mini books out. And it's called No More Fossils. And in that text, he narrates the kind of shift that he's an anthropologist, some of his early anthropological work was on the transition of East Germany leading up to the fall of the wall. Right, and what he found in that instance was that even up to like the day before the fall of the wall, you had people saying this will never change. Things are never going to change. There's nothing that we can do, right? And then all of a sudden, like there's just like this massive change that takes place. And so he narrates that and uses it as kind of a way to demonstrate that there are in our even recent history where like something that just all kind of evidence and all kind of experience would seem to suggest is just not going to move, not going to happen, and then just all of a sudden something shifts and it happens. Right, so I think we need more of that work around just what are the kinds of things that can give us a sense that something can move, that something can happen, and something different can be possible.
We have time for one more quick question. Somebody has one?
The troublemaker in the back?
Oh, yeah. I'm curious, what type of changes would you like to see? And are you worried about the consequences?
The consequences of those changes?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my argument earlier was, just to set it up, was, you know, other countries are not going to stop their economical interests. And if that means devastating the earth, then that's what they're going to do. And nobody, I mean, United States does the most good for the most people. So if there's going to be a country that's going to dominate any space, you know, why not us? And so if we eliminate, if we you know, decide to, you know, scale back our production in any type of energy sector, you know, pick one, and another country replaces that effort, and then they tend to dominate a part of the world, that seems no bueno for us. They're not going to do what's in the. No one. I'm wondering who today, after we had a chance to be the rulers of the world after World War II, would patrol the ocean in a way that created fairness and equity for everybody. I just don't see that happening if we allow someone else to do that. That's my concern.
Sure. So, to answer your first question, I think anybody with even an ounce of humility would need to say, like, yes, I'm going to say there need to be changes. These are what I'm proposing. But yes, I'm scared of what would happen. But also, like, we can't just be like, be frozen by that. And to kind of the larger point, I think that there are infrastructural changes that I don't necessarily think would need to lead to a dramatic kind of decrease of the United States on the world stage. Things like what would it change in terms of kind of the political the political kind of power on the world stage if we made the shift to trains and mass transit, put resources into that rather than EV vehicles, right? Just something like that is simple. That doesn't seem to me like it would necessarily lead to opening the door and saying, China, come on in.
Right, but isn't that
Right.
negligible at best?
What's that?
Isn't that de minimis at best? I mean, the trade-off there seems pretty low, given the fact that other, parts of the world aren't doing anything.
Right, but that, so this is what, even in the very first COPs, this is what already, the first COP in Tokyo with President Bush, this was the very first reason. Already Bush was recognizing the importance of climate change, right? But he said, well, if China's not gonna do it, we're not gonna do it, right? If India's not, and then China said to India, they're not gonna do it, we're not gonna do it. So at some point, I think somebody, and China is recognizing, right? They're continuing to intensify coal extraction, but they're intensifying extraction of minerals for batteries and things like that too, other kind of alternative energies. So I think that something like an infrastructural change in the U.S. To more mass transit, yes, that's a small step, but it's like I pointed out on the there are other countries that are they're even kind of exceeding the U.S. in terms of their standards of living, and so I don't think it has to be a trade-off of lowering standards of living or allowing somebody else to come over and take over world domination if we're going to lower our carbon footprint. I don't see that that's evidently a trade-off.
Can you indulge us, Cindy, on one more question?
We don't have time, Scott. I'm
All right,
sorry, man.
that's
We
fair.
got-
We'll
yeah, we
continue
got-
the
we got
conversation
time.
out there.
Okay, yeah, that's a good one for the hallway. So
All right.
let's thank Dr.
Thank
Rowe.